America, particularly Irish Catholics. And I find those parts really kind of resonated with me. I was quite interested in them, and I was glad to see it, actually documented and noted, and also how how they, in a way, certainly from my own perspective, almost once they were assimilated into that kind of wider white sphere, in some cases they embodied that kind of mindset, that otherism, and they kind of, they promoted that themselves. That bothers me as an Irish person to see that having gone on in America. There's been some famous Irish politicians who have actually kind of denounced Irish Catholics on that basis, that they are not considered Irish. So there was a woman called Bernadette Devlin, I think it was, and she had famously said that the Irish Americans were not her people. She empathized more, could understand the struggle of, and could relate to the struggle of those minority groups in America that were, oppressed, and that were facing the same things that Irish Catholics in Ireland faced under British rule, and then obviously under subsequent kind of devolved administration. So I find those points particularly of particular interest.
Yeah, and I intentionally included Irish Catholics or Catholics in the U.S. as well as Jews in the U.S. as well as Mormons in particular, to show, to make multiple points. So the first point is that religious minorities have always historically not been afforded the full panoply of religious freedom rights that we instill in our laws and even normatively. And the reason why it is so fascinating when you talk about Catholics, Jews, and Mormons, immigrants in particular, is because they were legally white. So we already know it's become mainstreamed that if you are not racialized as white or legally white, then you will be discriminated against, that you will be other, that you are not a member of the majority group that holds and wields all the power and therefore distributes all of the wealth and resources and power in the country. But we don't really think about how religion plays a role in power hierarchies and power distributions. And the second point, the second reason I included those groups was to show how corrupting power can be. And that's a universal issue, is that one group can become the oppressed. And that doesn't necessarily mean that when they are liberated, however we define that, or once they become equal, however we define that they are incapable themselves of being oppressors and being co-opted into the system that is structured to always produce an other, right? And always hoard power and wealth in a particular category, a certain master category. So yes, I think that transition, which I'm happy to go into detail, is one that we should take note of, that affects not just Muslims, which is obviously the primary subject of my book, but all groups that are in some way oppressed or experience some form of subordination, either now, in the past, or in the future.
Amazing. So very, very quickly, we're very pleased and honored to welcome our wonderful guest today, Professor Sahar Aziz, whose bio I'm just about to pull up. Professor Aziz, if you wouldn't mind very, sort of introducing yourself, it sort of simplifies the process a little bit. And I'll pull up your extensive bio. If I read your whole bio, we'll be here for an hour and a half just reading your bio. So, because it's very extensive and it's wonderful, mashallah. So, yeah, please.
Thank you. So my name is Sahar Aziz. I am a professor of law, a Middle East studies scholar, and a Chancellor Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers University Law School in Newark. I am also the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. That is the first civil rights center at a US law school that focuses primarily on the civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians in the US, as well as the geopolitics of US foreign policy with their countries of origin. So with the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, because the international events and US foreign policy in Muslim majority countries certainly impacts the human and civil rights of those diasporic communities in the US. And I am the author of The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, which I'm excited to talk about today with you, Hassan.
Thank you, Sahar, and with myself and Natalia, of course. Natalia sort of started us off in the conversation. What is race? I mean, it's such an obvious question to ask, but if we really break things down, what is race? Before we get into, you know, the racialization of Muslims or the racial Muslim, what is race? Is there such a thing as race? Race
is very real and not real at the same time. It's not real because it's socially constructed, meaning that it is not some sort of empirical fact or biological fact or something that can be, you know, empirically determined. It is whatever a society determines it is. And it's very real because it has impact. It has consequences, very material and measurable consequences, and usually they're adverse consequences. So first is the categories of race that a society decides, what labels it uses matters. And then the other is who falls into the particular category. And then third, what are the consequences of being in that category? So if you think of the US context, which is what I focus on in this book, is you have Black, you have white, you have brown, it used to be Hispanic, it used to be Mexican, it used to be, now it's Latinx, you have Asian, and even within Asian, there are different categories, and oftentimes those categories or labels can be conflated or overlap with what we would traditionally think of as national origin. And national origin is much more deterministic or factually based. You can say this person is of Egyptian origin in terms of their national origin or their ancestry, or of Indian origin. But of course, that's post-Westphalian in terms of the concept of nation state. So we could even go farther back and say, well, origin of a particular empire or origin of a particular geographical space, and where do the lines get drawn? So I acknowledge that complexity. But just to keep it simple, I'm going to focus on the nation state context. So in the United States, the two racial categories that have mattered the most and have really defined the social constructions of various races is Black and white. And so the people who settled here from Northwest Europe, England, and then other Northwestern countries in Europe categorized themselves as white at some point in time, even though in Europe, you weren't white, you were English, or you were from a particular region or village. You know, so how you categorized yourself to create your in-group and your out-group, to create the good people, the bad people, was not necessarily based on race, or as we know it in the US. So Black is considered at the very bottom of the racial hierarchy, and white is considered at the very top. And that is a direct result of slavery, right? The enslavement of Africans that was necessary in order to exploit their labor, in order to dehumanize them, and in order to become wealthy off of them by white people becoming wealthy. And remember, many of these white people back home in their home countries were at the very lowest end of whatever hierarchies they had there, social hierarchies. But when they came to the US, they put themselves at the top. And so as a result, when you have white at the very top and Black at the very bottom, then you naturally will have a spectrum in between. And this is where I think immigrants come into play, which we can go into in more detail later. But what I think is important when understanding race in America is, one, it is a master category, which means it directly affects the experiences you have in this country, particularly as they come with regard to dignitary experiences, material experiences, and your experiences with the law and with the state. And that's where the relevance comes. So even though someone says, I don't see color, I don't care about race, that's a very individualized, subjective determination that does not in any way reflect the reality of people living in this society. And even if you don't understand that or recognize it, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist and it's not actually operating. So I would, that's really the in a nutshell, how I approach race. And I would just point some of the listeners, I'm not the one who created that concept. This is a concept that Edward Bonilla Silva has written about in his brilliant book on racial formation. Derek Bell has written about it in the critical race legal literature. Joe Fagan has written about it in the sociology and race literature. And so there's plenty of literature, which I cite in the book, that talks about what is race and how it's socially constructed, particularly in the US context.
There's a lot of discussion these days, not least of all, especially in the US, one could say, around the question of critical race theory, and people of a certain political leaning oftentimes, I mean, not only, but very often will say, well, this is made up, these types of discussions, supposedly academic discussions, it's all, Foucauldian, it's all made, this is really irrelevant to wider discussions around the state of the nation. What would your response be to those types of charges? And very often they'll say, this is a leftist kind of ploy. This is really to kind of pull the wool over, people's eyes. And anyway, how the discussion can go sometimes.
Now, it's been fascinating to watch the growing popularity and infamy simultaneously of critical race theory, because before Trump's election, it was a relatively obscure legal theory that was often dismissed and relegated to the margins, even within legal academia. Oftentimes because the people who were using it to explain, why law can be weaponized to continue to subordinate Black communities and brown communities and privileged white communities. Critical race theory explained that. So it's a legal theory that arose, that was kind of a branch of the critical legal studies school of thought, which critical legal studies challenged legal formalism. And critical legal studies essentially said that, look, everything is subjective and it's all about power. And so if you want to understand law, and if you want to analyze law, and if you want to interpret law and draft law, you have to accept that power is really what matters, not these formalistic texts as what's actually written in the Constitution or what's actually written in a statute. But you need to understand the political context, the social context, the economic context, and really power is an integral part of legal intellectual thought. And the critical race theorist said, well, but you're forgetting that, one, race matters, because the critical legal scholars were not acknowledging how race affects power. And they were very formalistic in that regard, particularly when you're in the US context. And then they also, the critical race theorists said, well, I don't think we should completely dismiss law, because critical legal studies tended to say, look, law is really not as important as we claim it is. We need to get rid of this law fetish. As I said, sometimes law can be quite helpful in producing equity. And it's really about how we use the law. So they were a little bit more serious about taking anti-discrimination law, or they were willing to take anti-discrimination law more seriously, but still acknowledge, who makes the law, who enforces the law, how much resources is relegated to the enforcement. All of these things matter. And then structures, political structures and economic structures matter. So anyway, it was really an outgrowth of the 1970s critical legal studies movement. In the 1980s CRS was started. Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Neil Gatanda, Gerald Torres, Adrian Wing. I mean, there are many people who are Angela and Wachi Willig. There are many people who are considered kind of the first and second generation of the creation of critical race theory. And again, it was very limited within the legal academic sphere. It got more popular, or it became more mainstream recently, because over the last 20 years, or perhaps over the last 10 years, it certainly started when the first Black president was elected to the United States, which caused a near hysterical response and backlash by many white conservative Americans who were not necessarily part of the fringe right, but they certainly became, this is when you see the Republican Party shifting farther and farther to the right. You saw it during the Tea Party movement. And then when Obama becomes president, it becomes this mainstreaming, right, of anti-Blackness. And now, not that anti-Blackness hasn't always been in America, and it was mainstream, most certainly during the Civil Rights Movement before that. But at least one of the, I think, positive developments of the 1960s and 70s Civil Rights Movement is that at the very least, it started to shame being overtly anti-Black. It started to make it where it was not appropriate within mainstream discussions and media, gradually to be so anti-Black. And so much of it was pushed to the private sphere or kind of undercovered. So I'm not saying that anti-Black racism does not exist, but I think we have to acknowledge what is considered acceptable and what isn't, in figuring out, who holds these prejudicial views, whether it's anti-Black or anti-Muslim. But anyway, so what happens when Obama starts to become, as a serious candidate, is this anti-Black racism that had certainly been there started to come out. And fascinatingly and very troublingly, it was expressed through Islamophobia. So, and I interpret that as being overtly anti-Black racism was considered taboo, right? You could get fired from your job for it if you were a public figure. You could get shamed publicly. You could get censored, but you could be as Islamophobic as you wanted. And that was patriotic. That was considered rational, reasonable, and patriotic. It was something that people would get credit for and be praised for. And so that was the way they attacked Obama. They really wanted to attack him because he was Black. And they did not want a Black president in the White House.
That was the Edward Saadian sort of point, right, that he made many, many years ago at this, by now, in Covering Islam, for example, about how, in a time when he was writing in the 90s or I forget how old, Covering Islam is pretty old at this point, that in a time when no other form of overt racism was allowed or permissible, the only type of racism that was regularly practiced was anti-Muslim racism, and Islamophobia as a term hadn't been coined at that point. What do you say, Professor Aziz, in response to people who will often argue, who will contend that, well, Islam isn't a race, so how can one even be racist towards such a diverse group of people? It's what's your response to that?
Let me just finish one point about critical race. The transition after Obama was that African Americans and their allies started to push back against this rise in right-wing white extremism. And they started to emphasize their narrative and their framing with systemic racism, because those who were on the far right would say, look, we're in a colorblind society, which had been the mainstream narrative starting in the 1980s. And we are not a racist country anymore. You're stuck in the past. This is not the 1960s. We do not have, whatever anti-Black racism we have in society, it's an anomaly, it's at the fringes, and it's not a serious societal problem. And they started then to focus on systems and structures and say, it's not just about intent. It's not just about what you verbally articulate. It's how systems are structured to set people up to fail, or set people up to not be socially mobile, or to be stuck in poverty or stuck in unemployment, or completely or pipelined into the criminal justice system. And that Black people were essentially are victims of this systemic anti-Black racism. And you can take that same systemic approach and look at the immigration context and how it affects certain immigrants worse than other immigrants, right? Central Americans or Muslims, as opposed to people from Europe or Eastern Europe. And so how kind of global white supremacy affects even our immigration system, people from Canada as opposed to people from Mexico. And so systemic racism and looking at systems and structures is a component of critical race theory. And so that's when you had more emphasis on that is when then critical race theory started to become the boogeyman and the scapegoat. When in fact, what people are criticizing when they criticize critical race theory is not necessarily that literature, which again is very legally based, but they're criticizing any kind of challenge to the systems in the US that continue to produce these racial disparities on a group level, not at an individual level, but as a group level. So if you look at the outputs and say, okay, let's just look at the percentage of people that are in prison, the percentage of people that are unemployed, the percentage of people that live below poverty or just above it, the percentage of people that live in substandard housing, the percentage of people who have college degrees or have or the quality of schooling, K through 12 schooling. And let's divide that up by race, and let's compare the percentage of Black people and Latino people and whatever race you want, white people in these different categories. And what you will find consistently is an overrepresentation of non-white people. So if 13% of the population is Black, which it is in the US, if you have a fair system, then they should only be about 13, 15, maybe 11% in these category or in these life experiences that are not the ones that people want, right? Nobody wants to end up in jail. Nobody wants to end up poor. Nobody wants to end up unemployed. And so there's something wrong with the system. If you don't think there's something wrong with the system, then something's wrong with them. And then you think all of them and that tends to allude back to eugenics and biological racism. That, oh no, it's all of you. And this is when you get into the negative stereotypes about Blacks being lazy, the negative stereotypes about Blacks being inherently criminal, inherently prone to joining gangs and becoming violent and being drug dealers, etc. And instead of looking and saying, well, how do the systems create this misrepresentation, overrepresentation? Instead of saying, oh, no, it's biological racism. Even though nobody says that, they say it's individual responsibility. It's your fault individually. That is dog whistle politics, which is coded racist language, biological racist language. So that's kind of the trajectory of how critical race theory now has become this infamous and famous legal theory, because it has explained these phenomena vis-a-vis the law. Right? But these phenomena don't affect just the law. They affect healthcare, they affect housing, they affect businesses, right? They affect every aspect of a society.
Amazing. And and I'll pass over to you entirely shortly as well. But as far as the sort of challenge that some people will put forward about Islamophobia being this made up thing, serving a type of leftist agenda or
So my book is called The Racial Muslim, but for those of you who read it, you'll realize that the book is not arguing that Muslim identity is a race. The book is arguing that when you understand that Muslim identity has been racialized and is being treated like a race, remember race is a social construction, then you can understand the paradox. And this paradox is essentially what animates the book and what caused me to write the book. The paradox is, how is it that in a country that privileges religious freedom, particularly for religious minorities, this is what it was founded on, in its law and in its social norms, and I think every American will agree, it's the First Amendment of the US, we value religious freedom, in an abstract sense. How does a country with that identity, and how does it so overtly discriminate against a religious minority, and a significant religious minority? There are about 5 to 6 million people in the US that are Muslim, and there's 1.8 billion in the world. So this is it's a bona fide religion. And yet our politicians, our neighbors, our coworkers, our media, our government officials have been unabashed and oftentimes even proud of engaging in behavior that is clearly anti-Muslim right, clearly assumes certain stereotypes about Muslims and Islam, that they are disloyal, that they are presumptively prone to becoming terrorists, that they are illiberal, that they are anti-democratic, that they are misogynistic. And much of this is part of Edward Said's Orientalism theory, right? I mean, Edward Said focused a lot on Islam and Arabs. A lot of it was related to Arab identity and the history of the Middle Eastern relationship, the geopolitics, international relations between the Middle East and Europe and the Middle East and the US. And so I certainly build on that and I cite him. But I think when you get into the post 9/11 era is when you see Orientalism take kind of a different track, or it starts to perhaps expand, where it really is about the racialization of Muslim identity. And so once Muslims are seen as a race, then they are now in this hierarchy, this racial hierarchy, and post 9/11, they have been pushed to near the bottom of it. So Blacks will always be at the bottom so long as we have the legacy of slavery. And until we can somehow, and there's argument as to whether America can ever overcome, right, it's so deep-seated anti-Black racism that's just cooked and baked into its system. And I'm sure, I mean, we all want that to happen and we all work towards it, but there's a debate as to whether it's possible. But as long as that continues to kind of structure race in the US, Blacks will be at the bottom. And so that's where you get immigrants who are trying as hard as they can to stay as far away from Blackness and to be as close to whiteness so that they are not subordinated, so that they are not treated as Black. Because in America, to be treated as Black is to have to overcome more hurdles, more challenges, and be questioned and be presumed incompetent, presumed criminal, and to have all kinds of negative stereotypes that you have to overcome in order to succeed. But if you are white, and if you're presumed white, then you're presumed to be competent, you're presumed innocent. If you make a mistake, it's just a mistake. It's not something that you should be punished for the rest of your life or indicative of some kind of genetic flaw. If you are not, you don't have to be 2 or 3 or 4 times as smart as the average in order to prove that you are deserving of particular material benefits or power. Right? That's what we talk about when we talk about the privileges of whiteness. And you can talk about it in any kind of hierarchy, the privileges of being male in a patriarchal society, the privileges of being upper middle class or high class socioeconomically in a classist society, the privileges of being able-bodied in a society that privileges being able-bodied and subordinates being disabled, right, based on how that society is structured. So it's not just race. There are many hierarchies that interplay and intersect with each other. But in America, race is one of the master categories. So that's what I mean by the racialization of Muslims. And I think that's when you can then understand why there's such over racism and discrimination against Muslims. And I'll just note that those who were reading the news, especially during Trump's campaign and then also while he was president, there was a very measured and intentional framing of Islam as being a violent political ideology. That was not accidental. The reason why many of these far-right politicians, and they weren't that far right, by the way, some of them were considered moderate Republicans, did that is because they knew that their base, which was Christian evangelical, cared deeply about religious freedom rights. They knew that their base felt that they themselves were victims of religious persecution by the so-called secular liberal elites of the East and West Coast. And they did not want to have their base see them as being anti-religious freedom. And there was a quagmire. Well, this is a religious minority. And if we're going to persecute them especially through national security law and policy, have we opened the door then to persecute other religious minorities? Can other people use that and say in other contexts? So that's where they came up with the strategy. Oh, well, it's not a real religion. It's the devil's work, right? It's a violent political ideology. And therefore, they could now fall into the category of race. And we can keep religious freedom pure, and we don't have to worry about eroding it for our white conservative evangelical base. And we can continue to harass, persecute, oppress deport, ban Muslims, and now we're in racial category, which is fair game when it comes to kind of the partisan political contestations.
And I mean, early on, you're talking about the sort of the constructed nature of race. So people who erroneously or argue that Islam or Muslims don't fit a racial category because of phenotypical differences and what have you, and they're missing the point. Hence the use of the word the racialization of Muslims. That they're given certain universal, timeless qualities that are imputed to them, and if one is, and I don't want to keep hogging the mic here, but something you mentioned early on in your book, and elsewhere in sort of public discussions, with when 9/11 happened, the destruction of the Twin Towers, because 9/11 happened around the world in other ways as well, right? It was just a normal day for other people. But when 9/11 got etched in our global historic memories, you were a law student, if I remember correctly, and the way you described, which is very, very interesting. Speaking of hierarchies, you said that you went from being racially, what was the word? Racially ambiguous to all of a sudden becoming racialized, which, I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but it's very, very interesting because you're ethnically Arab. So Arabs historically in the American context pre 9/11, as far if I remember correctly, were seen as white essentially, right? Or in so many words, not black, certainly, not brown so much. I mean, just you had your own sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, epithets such as sand nigger, things like that, those were around. But it's like, historically, Arabs in the American context came from a certain affluent background. Very typically, I mean, the history of immigration to the UK, for example, of Muslims, let's say, is somewhat different, considerably different from the history of immigration in the US, as far as the economic, educational background. All of which is to say, right, to kind of continue to problematize the narrative, which is what you're doing. You're not offering a simplistic narrative, which that is hierarchies exist in societies as such. And so you pre 9/11 enjoyed, as it were, certain benefits of your racial kind of ambiguity, and then post 9/11, you've had to, as it were, I'm putting words in your mouth, but in so many words. I mean, I know this is a global Muslim problem, speaking for all Muslims here, right? But I mean, it's certainly a Western Muslim problem. I think I'm allowed to say that much, where Muslims have to kind of justify their very being, their Muslimness. Like, I'm Muslim, or I'm Muslim in such and such a way. Anyway, you see.
Well, let me expound on that a bit.
Yeah.
So and I go into the book about two chapters. One chapter is the legal component of the racialization or the race categorization of people from the Middle East and North Africa, because there is a really fascinating checkered history, which Ian Haney Lopez has written about in his book White by Law, Khalid Beydoun has written about in some of his law review articles, and then there's been some sociologists who have also written about this. But in terms of what Middle Eastern and North Africans are raced legally, because socially and legally are two different things. And we learned that about how Jews and Catholics were treated in the early 20th century, which I'll get into later. But until 1945, if you were from the Middle East or North Africa, which is a very large part of the world, it has over 30 nation states now, and the phenotype of the people from those places, meaning their physical characteristics, what they look like, varies widely. From people who would be raced as Black in the public square in the US, because if they're from southern Egypt, if they're from parts of Morocco, and actually every Arab country has people whose origins were from sub-Saharan Africa, such that when they mixed in with the populations that also came parts from Eastern Europe and other parts of Europe, could be raised physically as white in the US, or excuse me, physically raised as black in the US. So what happened is that the Syrians and the Lebanese, and their numbers were very small as compared to immigrants from other parts of, well, from Europe in particular. There were about between 150,000 to about 250,000. Compare that to about 16 million, between 1900 and 1930 that came from Eastern and Western Europe, Eastern and Southern Europe. They went to court and they said, because what was happening is the immigration services and the government were saying, yeah, you're Asian. And we have laws on our books that exclude, that deny Asian, well, that deny anyone that is not raised as white legally from naturalizing as a US citizen. So not only did they not let people come to the country if they were from Asia, and that was very explicitly an anti-Chinese law that then affected Indians and other people from South and East Asia, but it also affected Arabs or Middle East North Africans who wanted to naturalize. So they got here somehow, and now they wanted to be citizens. But the law said only white people could become US citizens, could naturalize. So they went to court and they battled it out. And the book goes into the history of how some won and how some lost, and how they literally would go to court and say, look at my skin, look at my skin, look at my hair, look at my facial features. And many of them were Christians because of just that was the migration pattern. And so they were disproportionately Christians, and they would use their Christian identity to say, look, I am from Europe. I'm originally from Europe. I'm Caucasian, I'm Aryan, whatever they could find. But their Christian religion, interestingly, was used oftentimes successfully in addition to what they look like to say, I'm white. So if you shift then to 1960, so around 1945, not coincidentally, when the US is now really interested in controlling the oil of the Middle East, and does not want to perpetuate any kind of negative stereotypes or negative publicity about their newfound allies in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and other places in the Persian Gulf where most of the oil has now been discovered, then you start to see this warming towards the Arab identity as not, well, maybe you guys aren't Asian. Okay, you are a civilized people, or you have origins of civilization, or you are somewhat tied to Europe, because Europe was the center of civilization as far as American history was concerned, and American norms were concerned. So in 1965, the laws changed, the immigration laws changed, such that there were no longer national origin quotas. Because in 1924, the immigration law changed to say that if you were, that they would only take 2% of the population from a particular country based on the 1890 census. And that was intentional to keep out Italian Catholics, Irish Catholics, and Eastern European Jews, because they had come since 1890 to 1930, there had been over 30 million they had come. And so the American population was changing, and it was changing from its very secure Protestant identity and majority to now starting to have millions of people who were not Protestant, who were Catholic and Jews. The Asians had been excluded since the 1880s. So 1965 says, okay, we're going to start changing that. We're no longer going to have our Asian exclusion laws, which actually started to get lifted in the 1950s. And that's when you see in the US, most people who are from the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, which is where most of the Muslim majority countries are. Obviously, I'm not including Indonesia, which is one of the largest Muslim majority countries. So, but the Indonesian American community is not as large as those from the other Muslim majorities. That's when most of them came. And that's those of us who are here, we are children or grandchildren. Now we're getting into the great-grandchildren of those who came post-1965. Those people, starting in the 1970s, Middle East, North Africa, not South Asians, then the government seals the deal and passes regulations that says in the US Census, if you're from the Middle East, North Africa, you are white. So legally, all of us, no matter what we look like, and if you've been to Egypt, and if you've met Egyptians, I'll just use Egypt where I'm from, There are many, many Egyptians who in the American public, if you're just walking down the street, are raced as Black. But when they fill out the census, it's white.
Amazing. Natalia is someone who...
I mean, do you want me to tell you about the issue of the racial ambiguity? So as a result, just so that you understand, so that's law, right? Socially, it's so specific to the context, because in America, the social construction of Blackness is based on one rule called the one drop rule. If you have one drop of Black blood, you are Black. Why? Because that makes you a slave, right? If we go back in history, and that means your property, and that means that the white slave owner can make money. And also because many white slave owners raped their Black female slaves in order to intentionally reproduce slaves, which were worth a lot of money. And so it wasn't as if a child that was half Black and half white could go and say, well, I'm half white, so I shouldn't be a slave. So the economics of racism had to make it where just one drop of Black blood, you were Black, and therefore you were a slave and you were property, and you could make wealth for the white slave owner. And that has essentially stuck. And to me, the most obvious example is, why wasn't Obama a white president? He was half Black and half white. Why wasn't he a white president? If we're going to base it specifically on, who are your parents, it was because of what he looked like. Now, he wanted to be Black, but if he had said, no, I am a white president, I'm half white, I'm equally white as I am Black, society would not have accepted that. He doesn't get to control that. So race is also something that you don't have as much agency as you'd like, because it's so much based on what you look like. So before 9/11, many of us who were Middle East and North African, it so much depended on what you looked like, so much of it. So I was in Texas, and people thought I was Hispanic. They thought, more specifically, I was Mexican, because in Texas, many people don't even realize that there are more than 25 Spanish-speaking countries.
Hence your Mexico thing in the background.
Yes, Viva Mexico. And people assumed my name. My name is clearly not an English name. And they thought, oh, you must be Hispanic, you must be Mexican. They didn't even know that Aziz was an Arabic word, an Arabic name, or Sahar is a really common name in Egypt and Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's a very common name in the Muslim majority countries, and it's not in any way a Spanish name. But after 9/11, this is something that I know because it affected me. Tariq Aziz was the foreign minister of Saddam Hussein, who, by the way, was a Christian, Tariq Aziz. His name was in the newspaper all the time because, if you guys remember, he was in one of those cards where they were hunting for people. So Aziz kept coming up in the newspaper all the time. We're looking for the terrorist. We're looking for the terrorist. We're looking for Tariq Aziz. And I remember people kept saying, are you Iraqi? Are you related to him? And it was just surreal, not because that was such a stupid question, but one, they didn't realize how common the name Aziz was. It's like Smith in English. But it was surreal to me because I just so distinctly remember that my life before 9/11 was people were like, oh, you must be Mexican. They just had no idea what the origins of my name was. And then I could decide, right, depending on what I looked like. And so there was just more agency to what we call engage in identity performance, to cover your identity, to pass as something that you actually aren't. After 9/11, by being Muslim, that's it. It's as if, I always use the equivalent as Obama's skin color. He doesn't get to choose how society is going to see him racially. So once after 9/11, if you're Muslim or perceived to be Muslim like Sikh Americans, that's it. Now everybody's going to see you through a very specific lens and they're going to treat you accordingly. And that tends to be being treated poorly or at least inferior relative to other people that are higher up in the hierarchy, either based on their racial and religious identity. So that's how religion racializes. It is essentially operates the equivalent of skin color, which is what we're more traditionally accustomed to being the factor that racializes people in the US.
Amazing. Natalia, would you like to pick up on some points?
I'm just really glad to hear, your your personal experiences, because that was something that I was kind of curious about, particularly since, you know, you would have those kind of pre 9/11 lived experiences and then the post 9/11 lived experience and how that affected you. So it was really good to hear that. I was wondering if you could speak a little about the industry that sits behind Islamophobia, because we know it's not just politicians and it's not just the media even, and it's not just individuals and what, you know, their own perceptions. There's a whole industry behind it, and if you could maybe speak to that a bit, please.
Yeah. And that industry it's very scary. It's scary on multiple levels, the Islamophobia industry. The first is how successful it's been. The second is how acceptable it's been. And the third is how entrenched it's been, how long, and it continues until today. We just saw one consequence of it when it was discovered, or it was exposed, that Stephen Emerson and his organization, which is part of the Islamophobia industry, had paid informants, people who worked for the Council on American Islamic Relations, every month to essentially steal their confidential information and to snitch on them, and so that he could then use that information to do what he ultimately wanted, which was to take down CARE, a national civil rights organization. And CARE for Muslims is like the ADL for Jews. It's like the NAACP for African Americans. It's not the only civil rights organization, and there are many criticisms of CARE, just like there's criticisms of ADL, and there's criticisms of the NAACP. And thankfully, we have, you know, a robust or a growing robust Muslim civil society, as we do Jewish American and Black American and Hispanic, etc. But the point is, when if you want to go after one of the largest civil rights organizations that represents Muslims at a time when their civil rights are under attack, that's very Islamophobic, especially if you do it in these pernicious and nefarious ways. So the Islamophobia industry is effectively, and there's a great report called Fear Inc. by CAP, the Center on American Progress. And that's really what kind of blew the lid on the Islamophobia industry. Many of us who were in the field, because I was working in Washington, D.C. for over 7 years as a lawyer, as a plaintiff's civil rights lawyer, and also as pro bono counsel for many nonprofit organizations, including Muslim advocates. And we were working on post 9/11 discrimination. And we knew that there was a lot of money behind this movement that was constantly slandering and defaming our communities, because no matter what we would do, we couldn't get access to the media. The people who were being asked to testify on the Hill, the people who were being interviewed in mainstream media, they were all just rabid Islamophobes. And they were clearly not objective in any way. And so when that report came out, we thought, okay, this makes a lot more sense. We suspected it, but you don't want to be a conspiracy theorist if you don't have the proof to show, no, there's actually a movement. Fear Inc. found that at least by 2000, I believe it was 2013, there was 56 million. I believe right now it's over 100 million that's been spent just on defaming Muslims in America and defaming Muslim organizations, and essentially trying by any means necessary, including violations of the law, to discredit Muslim intellectuals, Muslim civil rights leaders, Muslim civil rights lawyers, organizations, and to try to redirect and continue to direct the resources of the state in the national security context to surveil Muslims, to surveil mosques, to harass Muslims, to harass mosques and Muslim leaders. And effectively, I mean, this is quintessential subordination. This is quintessential systemic racism. And we saw evidence of it. I mean, we've seen evidence of it in the last 20 years. But I think if there's one thing we should have understood from the January 6, 2021 insurrection, attempted insurrection by white far-right extremism, or white supremacists who were the base of Donald Trump, is that these people were planning in plain sight an insurrection while the state was obsessive in surveilling, harassing, intimidating Muslim communities, where they could not find, they had to manufacture terrorism. And I have a paper coming out called Manufacturing Muslim Terrorism, Entrapment and Sting Operations, where I empirically document all of that. And I also talk about it in my book, kind of in the bigger picture. But if that isn't systemic racism and the way that your resources are allocated based on these negative stereotypes, I don't know what is. Because if it's not racialized or it's not racist, then you look at where the threat is, right? You look at what people are doing, not what their religion is, or not what their political beliefs are that are completely legal. But you look at what are they doing to plan illegal activity. So the Islamophobia industry is alive and well. It has permeated into many mainstream organizations, unfortunately. And one thing that is particularly pernicious about the Islamophobia industry, which really saddens me, is that there are certain portions of Jewish American organizations, particularly those that are on the far right, that have supported it and perpetuated Islamophobia, even though Jewish communities suffer from anti-Semitism. And they suffer from anti-Semitism from white supremacist groups, the same groups that engage in Islamophobia. And so this deal with the devil, right? This deal that some of these groups are making is very pernicious, and it's very harmful to Jews as well as it is to Muslims. And they don't seem to understand that, if you support organizations that persecute one religious minority, you're perpetuating a system that could turn against you, and that has turned against you, and that is turning against you. Now, having said that, there are many other organizations that are Jewish Americans, that are Christian Americans. There's also the Christian evangelicals who are supporting the Islamophobia industry. But there are then other people who are in different faith communities, who are more progressive, and who see this and go, wait a minute, we do not accept treatment of any religious minority this way, or racial minority, and we have to oppose it. But unfortunately, the Islamophobia industry has successfully positioned itself in a partisan way rather than in a racist way. In other words, people don't see it as, oh, you all are just part of white supremacy and you are engaging in racism against Muslims. They've positioned themselves as, oh, we're Republican and we're patriotic and we just have different policies on national security, as if it's some objective formalistic approach, when in fact it's highly racialized. And it's not about being Republican or Democrat. It's about being racist or pluralistic or intolerant or tolerant.
White supremacists fear that white people are dying out. I mean, they genuinely fear it, right? So, that's part of the narrative, right? That while progressives will argue that the systemic racism and so forth, people on the other side of the fence will argue, well, there are legal sort of imperatives in set in motion, have been for a number of years now, which systematically underprivilege white people. So it's a problem, right? It's a problem of identity politics, no matter where we are. Right? I can't help but feel, for better, hopefully for better, but typically my touchstone tends to be sort of religiously understood. Islamic metaphysics by and large, but not only. Traditional religious understandings of things, of the human condition, tend to inform me. I try to make sense of things. So there's a Quranic verse, Thomas Cleary cites this verse, for example, the great late deceased translator of the Quran, amongst other amazing, very important texts. He cites this verse and says that this is the ideal sort of solution to the problem of racism, which is that, where God, to paraphrase, says most point of view in the Quran, that we have created you in tribes and nations and tongues so that you may come to know one another, right? So in other words, one could prefer that maybe it's a human problem to seek to other people, right? So I'm of a certain, socioeconomic, educational, sort of color background, class, etc. And I'm going to look down upon people who are different from me. Like, there's deep racism. I mean, I'm of South Asian heritage. There's a huge problem in South Asian communities vis-a-vis people who are Black, even vis-a-vis people who are white. Like, it manifests in other ways. It's like these people, I just heard, I mean, not to go on and on about this thing, but to kind of illustrate this human problem. And the lady who cleans a place here, so that's automatically placing that's a class thing, right? But she's South Asian, and she was saying, oh, white people, they don't really care about their children. At the age of 60, they say, go fend for yourselves. I didn't want to contradict her, but I sort of said, most of my friends are kind of white, and it's like, that's actually not very true. I heard my parents say this for years. My dad used to say, white people, they don't care about, so it's like the othering process happens all the time. So
I just like to interject here as a white person.
As a white person, as a token white person, right?
I'm more than happy to send them outside. They can fend for themselves, survival of the fittest. Not a bother. I think that woman's on to something.
Your parents didn't do that to you, did they?
Have you seen pictures of Belfast in the 80s?
No.
You got to get on that.
Oh, let me pull up some pictures from the 80s in Belfast. But okay, but I mean, jokes aside, maybe there's some truth. Maybe there's some truth to these stereotypes, right?
Well, I think so. So if you look at the implicit bias literature, it shows that yes, we all. I mean, this is kind of going into something way outside my area of expertise, which is social psychology. But the implicit bias literature has been informing critical race theory for years now. But it does show that our minds function in a way to try to self-preserve, right? To protect ourselves from things that could hurt us and to be closer or in spaces that are safe, right? We're constantly avoiding danger or things that could kill us. And that's very instinctive. And our mind categorizes. It has to categorize because we can't process every single detail. And that there is a consequence of that is how we measure people up and how we determine whether we feel that a person, from the most extreme is a danger or not to kind of a little bit less extreme is we want to be friends with them, we trust them. And all of that is informed by how we're socialized. And that's why stereotypes can be so powerful, because they become so deeply embedded in one's psyche. And, they've used examples of when you walk, if it's a dark night and you're walking on the sidewalk and you see someone coming to you that's Black, a Black male, do you cross the street? What if that person was a white male? Would you cross the street, right? And if you don't behave in the same way, you have to ask yourself, well, why would I cross the street for this particular guy if all things were the same? And that's where you might not even realize it. It might just be instinctive, as just an example. So I do think there is something to be said about human nature always trying to figure out who is safe, who is dangerous, who is good, who is bad. But at least when you're talking, say, about critical race theory, you're really looking at how does the law perpetuate inequity, injustice, and how does the law perpetuate oppression on people that don't deserve it, right? It's one thing to say, I have committed a crime and I must be punished for it. But what happens if you are just always presumed to be inherently going to commit a crime? And an example of that is in schools. Studies have shown two things about Black children, or about how schools mistreat Black children, discriminate against them. The first is the disparate disciplining, is that when you see, when white children engage in behavior that is technically in violation of some policy or practice, they tend to get punished in ways that are much less severe than if a Black student engages in the same activity. The second is special education, right? There are studies that show that Black children and other racial minorities in America are being overly represented and overly funneled to special education and essentially incorrectly diagnosed as compared to white children. So why is that happening? Because unless you think that they're genetically different because of their race, then there's something wrong with the system. There's something wrong with the structure. Who's making the decisions? What's the criteria? How is it emphasized? When are exceptions applied and not applied? There are ways that there are rules I can create that can categorically advantage certain groups without naming that group. And we always use this quintessential example when we do employment discrimination law, is we say, okay, if you want to be a school teacher, you must be 6 foot tall. Who does that discriminate against? Natalia?
It definitely discriminates against me. But actually, on that point, my aunt back in, it might have been the 80s, possibly, she in Belfast wanted to join the police service and was told she couldn't because she was under a certain height. Now, we weren't quite sure at the time whether or not there was merit to that, or whether it was because she was from a Catholic background, which was kind of a difficulty in.
Yes, so the question, I actually use teachers, but that actually is used in real life, and there's been cases in the US litigating that for police and firefighters, and it discriminates against women. But it doesn't say it's because you're a woman. But if we know that, as a matter of fact, the percentage of women that are over 6 feet tall is significantly less, then we don't have to say you can't apply if you're a woman. We can just say you have to be 6 feet tall. So I can find what we call proxies.
Natalia's also 5 foot, by the way, and I'm 5'8", so it discriminates against me as well.
So you can also discriminate against people from certain parts of the world because, fun fact, I think height, of all the things that genetically are passed down, height is the highest percentage, something like 60% probability in terms of how tall you're going to be based on your parents.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I also have long hair, but yeah, anyway.
But my point is, but you understand, you see my point, is that it's all about looking at these systems that facially appear neutral, but these systems are based on societies that are not neutral along multiple axis points. And I mean, we're just talking about race today. That's the axis point because of the subject of my book. But that's one way of looking at society when your ultimate goal is trying to create more equity, more equitable distribution of resources and wealth and power and opportunity and health and all the things that we aspire to want in our lives. And how can we, because there's always going to be scarcity. And so how can you distribute those benefits and those resources in ways that are equitable and not based on ways that are inequitable, informed by racism or racist stereotypes?
And how do we do that? What are some ways in which we can do that? I mean, short of having legal measures, and as a legal scholar, no doubt that would be one of the means by which we do things, right?
Well, if I had the answer, I would be very
hated.
Hated or wealthy or what. It depends on the context, but it's a really tough question, and it's an evolving question because society evolves and it's multifaceted. But the point is, you have to actually think about it. You have to complicate it. You have to problematize it. You can't accept that any rule is automatically going to create equity. You have to ask yourself, what's the factual background? What's the historical background? What's the social background? One rule in a particular context may create more equity or the same rule in another context, which would create more inequity, right? And so you just can't be a lazy thinker. And if you're the person who has policy-making authority, law-making authority, the authority to enforce the law and the policy, and one of the problems we have in the US, which is not unique to the US, but it certainly is something that is part of the American culture, is American exceptionalism, and how we just think that we are perfect, that whatever problems we have there, again, they're anomalies, they're unusual, these are bad apples, and we don't interrogate our own societies the way that we interrogate other societies, and the way that we're willing to see other societies and other cultures and other country, sometimes to a fault, sometimes in ways that actually are inaccurate, of saying, yeah, there's imperfections, and why is this happening? And there's injustice, and there's unfairness, and there's oppression. Why are we any different? I mean, if we want to use religious terminology, this isn't heaven. This isn't a utopia. And so this mentality, which is very anti-intellectual, but also very self-interested, because if you're benefiting from the status quo, how convenient it must be for you not to question it and to think that it is an exceptional system that really doesn't need much change except around the edges.
Well, but the United States, I mean, as it is today, does have an unusual history, right? As far as, when the early waves of European immigrants were finding sort of these lands, or sort of conquering these lands and taking over lands from native populations. I mean, a significant part of the narrative was that these lands were fulfilling something of the biblical sort of prophecies of, the kingdom of, of God in the world. So maybe that plays something of a role as far as this.
Oh, it absolutely does, but that doesn't mean that it's accurate.
Oh, no, of course. No. I mean, right. But it's just.
Manifest destiny, kingdom of God, America's Israel, right? And I talk about that in the first couple chapters of the book. Absolutely. Just as if you have to understand how Britain works, you have to understand its own history and how Ireland works, and the relationship between Ireland but you can't just assess the contemporary era without understanding that.
Of course.
And so in the US, we don't do that. We don't do it well in our schools, and we don't do it well in our public discourse. And so what we're seeing now by this systemic anti-racism movement by the young people in particular, which is kind of an outgrowth of the Black Lives Matter movement, is this demand for more truthful and earnest and honest conversations, because they see the inequity, and then they're being told, oh, that's an anomaly, or no, it's not as bad as you think, or they're just being told all sorts of responses that it's counterintuitive. And because of social media and because of technology, people can't hide things as easily as they could. You can't quash and silence the voices of those who are losing in the system, those who are being harmed by the status quo. And so once you have that evidence and it's glaringly in front of you, the gatekeepers in mainstream media no longer have as much control as they used to, because now you can have more influence over people in terms of the information that they're exposed to via TikTok, via Twitter, via Facebook, via Instagram. And not everybody now has to rely on ABC News and NBC News and CBS News, and that's all you've really got. And so this younger generation, that's where they get their information, they are now getting access to voices that would never get an interview on CNN, that would never get an interview on the mainstream media. And therefore, those people would never know their perspectives. And they would never know that, oh, wow, in my very same neighborhood or my very same state, there's somebody who's having an awful experience while I'm having this great experience. Maybe things aren't as perfect as I thought they were.
And maybe this is part, right, and maybe this is part of the reason why there's a major, a lot of voices are being systematically silenced as well. A lot of these sort of institutional voices who have their own platforms. I'm not going to mention names, but just generally speaking, there is a push to silence them, because the mainstream, the corporatized media outlets no longer have that much sway anymore. It's, if you take someone like Joe Rogan, for example, regardless of what one thinks of him, a single one of his podcasts reaches 11 million people on average. That's insane numbers. The next three in line are a little under 3 million each. They're all Fox News people. And they're way below In the past year, recently the numbers for CNN are 90,000 or something, just under 100,000, if I'm not misremembering. So these are, so how do we control those numbers? How do we control the narrative, whatever the narrative is, right? So this is, and maybe that's a discussion for a separate time and space. But I mean, you mentioned before the title of the new article that you work on, manufacturing terrorism, right? No doubt taking inspiration from Chomsky and Herman's Manufacturing Consent, that the argument of which classic book now is essentially that the nature of the mainstream media outlets, they were describing primarily print media at the time, they spoke to corporate interests, right? They were really primarily interested in representing the people who are paying the ad revenues, right? So, and that narrative hasn't changed tremendously. I mean, I think we've been experiencing for a few years a very unusual moment in this kind of, sort of human experiment, at least in the modern/postmodern context. I don't know how much longer that window is going to be open, though. I honestly doubt. I mean, I honestly am very cynical, but I mean, as long as we can, I think we need to make the best use of these venues. But to wrap up, any sort of final thoughts?
Well, I wanted to see if Natalia had any other questions before we wrap up. Yep.
Oh, so many questions, so many, and so little time. But really, I would just like to know, I suppose, because we're in the end, what you see, like what your future vision is in terms of what we can do, how we can kind of address this, what avenues we can take, what options are available to us. I say us because like this is a global issue, What's your thoughts on that?
Well, as a professor, I have a certain bias, which is to focus on education and quality education. So the first thing is just you can't shortcut out of learning. I mean, people have got their, I know it's tempting with the TikToks and the tweets and all that, and I think that's helpful in getting tips on things to read. But I hope that people make learning a lifetime endeavor and constantly read things that are peer reviewed and that have been subject to review by others, to be able to at least identify things that is just pure punditry versus things that are based on fact and based on research. And that's not to say that it's going to be objective. I don't believe that there's anything that's purely objective. I don't think there's anything wrong with having partiality, as long as you're honest about it, as long as you're transparent about what your sources are, what your analysis is, and what your interests are. And then people who read are not reading to be indoctrinated. They're not reading to memorize and blindly agree with what you write or what you say, but that they just take that in as one of the data points of other things they read. And so it's that ability to be a critical thinker. And the less critical thinking we have in a society, the more that fascism can rule, whether it's fascism from the right or from the left or from the center. So, I wrote a book. That's how I try to educate people. It's one out of millions, and I hope people will read my book and as well as others. I think the other thing that I can't control this, but I wish I could, is we need to desegregate our societies. I really think that is a deeply structural problem, at least in the United States. And segregation is not unique to the US, but we are a very segregated society. People who are of different socioeconomic classes don't interact with each other a lot. They don't go to school with each other. They don't work with each other. They don't socialize with each other. And you see that across race, and because race and class and race and wealth overlap heavily, where you have a disproportionate amount of wealth in white communities and less wealth in Black and brown communities. And so then that has kind of class implications. Same thing with religious differences, and just being able to befriend and know people and understand that there's so much diversity within categories of identity. Right? There are so many different types of Muslims, from their religiosity to their political beliefs, to their immigrant experiences, to their wealth. They're so different, that their views on women and feminism, and the same thing with Irish and with Irish Catholics. So because we tend to fall for the trap of homogenizing minority communities in particular, because minority communities, as a way to survive the oppression that comes with being a minority, is they unify, they unite, which helps kind of protect the group. But then they lose that freedom to be different, and to disagree with each other. And also people from the outside of that minority group just assume that there's only one or two spokespersons for them. And that also takes away some of their agency. And that's one of the costs of being a minority. So for example, one of the attributes of white privilege, or what I'll call majority privilege or power privilege, is that you can be an individual without affecting the reputation or the opportunities of the group. Right? If you make a mistake, that doesn't mean that all white people are like that. If you commit a crime, if you say something that people dislike, you have this individual freedom to be you. And nobody is going to automatically take that interpretation and impute it, especially if it's a negative interpretation, impute it on the whole group, which relieves you from that burden and that stress of having to, what we call, represent the race. That's a terminology in critical race theory. And that's a huge burden to carry. I mean, women carry, anytime you have a hierarchy, those that are at the lower part of the hierarchy have that burden to carry, because any mistake has very long-term consequences. And you don't get exceptions to the rules. And you don't get presumptions that it's just a mistake, rather than, oh, that's it. We have to fire you, or you're banished, or you're not smart. As if we're all perfect, but those who are in the majority, they're not perfect. It's okay. You always get a second, a third, a fourth chance, because at the end, you're human. So it's really about how do you figure out in your individual life to keep learning, as a lifetime thing, interacting with people, listening to people who have different perspectives, and really just trying to get out of the bubbles that we're all in. And it takes a lot of work. But I think it's worth it, and it makes life a lot more interesting. And just finally, think about structures more. Think about structures. And you really have to kind of step back and say, everything is a system and a structure. How is it shaped? Who shapes it? What is the impact of this? Everything from how you get your food, to how you are educated, to what is accessible on the market, to how people treat each other. There's just, it's a never-ending inquiry, but it helps make things that are otherwise invisible quite visible, and then you see the world in a very different way. And I think in a way that can help produce more equity and more justice, which is not something we'll have in absolute terms, because we will never live in a utopia, but at least it's something that we can always be working towards. And then finally, practice kindness. Be kind to people. There's not enough kindness in this world.
Beautiful. Well, I think that's a powerful note to end on. Practice kindness. I mean, maybe we can end on this particular note, which is hadith, prophetic tradition. The Prophet, the Blessed Prophet, once said to his companions that give victory to the oppressor and the oppressed alike. And his companions responded, O Messenger of God, we can understand how we can give victory to the oppressed, but how do we give victory to the oppressor? And the Blessed Prophet responded by freeing him or her from his own oppression. So when one oppresses, when we oppress, right, as human beings, it's a human problem, we end up oppressing ourselves. So, I mean, and if I remember correctly, it's also Fanonian, Frantz Fanonian conceit that, it's everyone suffers in the end. So, and we must be aware, lest, and you mentioned this earlier on as well, suggested this as well, that we must be very careful lest those, of us, if we are oppressed today, once we become, superior, whatever, in charge of things, or whatever that means, how that looks, that we don't become the oppressors ourselves, and that the constant sort of self purification and taking ourselves to account. But thank you so much again for joining us and for your wonderful work.
Thank you. It was lovely.
And
to hear some comment.
And for very for representing Mexico very well as well.
Thank you. And I'll just put in a couple of tips for my social media. So those who want to continue to follow me, I have a website, saharazizlaw.com. And that is also my tag for Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, Sahar Aziz Law. And hopefully you all will also check out the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is csrr.rutgers.edu, and you can get on our newsletter and follow us there. But I hope this is just the beginning of a conversation, and that we continue to talk about these issues. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Hassan, for providing these types of opportunities for people like me and others to give us a platform for our voices. And that's a important role that you play. So I'm deeply grateful.
Oh, thank you so much. And it's really our pleasure and honor. It's a huge blessing to be able to do these sorts of things. And we need to talk. I mean, talking helps. I think this is how we figure out life. It's how we figure out our own individual day-to-day problems, how we figure out more global problems. And it's how we realize that we're all the same, essentially. We may look ever so slightly different, but we're all very much the same human problems. Anyway, God bless you all. Thank you all for joining us, and please like and subscribe. I hate having to say that every time, but bye everyone. Take care.
Thank you.